Welcome to a new topic on corporate governance and other ESG considerations in investment analysis. A bit of warning here, this is not the most interesting topic to say the least. Thankfully, it's not too lengthy, and we'll try to keep it short and concise for you. In this first lesson, we discuss the variations in ownership structures globally. We start with learning the distinction between dispersed and concentrated corporate ownership structures and the conflicts within different ownership structures. We'll also learn the types of influential shareholders and the effects of ownership structure on corporate governance. Quite a bit to cover, so let's jump right in. Corporate ownership structures can be classified as either concentrated or dispersed. Globally, the most common ownership structure category is concentrated ownership, where a single shareholder or a group of shareholders have control over the corporation. These controlling shareholders can be a family, other companies, or a sovereign entity. China, France, India, South Korea, and Singapore are examples of countries where the state and/or large corporations predominantly hold controlling stakes in many of the companies in the country. Dispersed ownership refers to the situation where the shareholders are numerous and none has control. In Australia, Ireland, United Kingdom, and the United States, ownership of public companies is generally characterized by dispersed shareholdings. Listed companies are rarely under the control of a major shareholder. There are also countries classified as having hybrid ownership structures. In Canada, Germany, Japan, Netherlands, and Switzerland, there's a rather even mix of companies that have concentrated ownership structure and companies that have dispersed ownership structure. Do note that the percentage of ownership is not always a reliable indicator of concentration of control. In some cases, shareholders with less than 50% ownership can have a high level of control. For example, a minority shareholder could have control of a corporation through horizontal ownership arrangement. This involves companies with mutual business interests like key customers or suppliers that have cross-holding share arrangements with each other. Ownership arrangements can also be vertical, where the company or group has a controlling interest in holding companies, which in turn have controlling interests in operating companies. Another disconnect between control and percentage ownership comes in the form of dual-class shares, where one class of shareholders has fewer voting rights, while the other class has superior voting rights. When used in connection with vertical ownership arrangements, the company or group at the top of the pyramid can issue to itself a disproportionately high number of shares with superior voting rights, and thus maintain control of the operating companies with relatively fewer total shares of a company owned. Depending on the type of ownership structure present in a corporation and the concentration of voting power, different kinds of conflicts may emerge among shareholders and between managers and shareholders. Dispersed ownership and dispersed voting power describes a situation where shareholders do not hold power over managers. In this situation, principal-agent conflict is likely. Shareholders want shareholder value maximized, while managers may use the firm's resources to their own advantage. Concentrated ownership and concentrated voting power refers to a situation where so-called strong shareholders hold power over minority shareholders and weak managers. This arrangement allows controlling shareholders to control the board of directors and effectively control and monitor management. The downside of this situation is that a principal-principal problem may arise, where the strong shareholders can make decisions to benefit themselves at the expense of minority owners. Dispersed ownership and concentrated voting power indicates that the majority of the shares are not owned by strong controlling shareholders. Rather, the controlling shareholders gain control over other minority shareholders through ownership arrangements or superior class shares we talked about earlier. Likewise, these allow them to control or monitor the management, which again leads to the same principal problem, where the strong shareholders may take advantage of minority shareholders. And lastly, concentrated ownership and dispersed voting power occurs in the presence of voting caps, where the voting rights of large share positions are restricted. Some countries enact voting caps to discourage foreign investors from acquiring companies that belong to a strategic industry. To identify corporate governance risks, it can be helpful to consider the various categories of influential shareholders and how they may impact corporate governance. We'll discuss the effects of shareholders like banks, families, government, institutional investors, group companies, private equity firms, foreign investors, and even managers and board directors on the corporate governance risks of a company. Firstly, banks. When a bank lends money to a firm or holds an equity stake, the bank can often exert some control over that corporation. In some cases, the bank may use its influence to encourage the firm to take out large, expensive loans from the bank. Corporate governance controls here could ensure that the bank does not take advantage of its role as lender at the expense of other shareholders. In Latin America and some other places, family ownership is common. It's also common for individuals to sit on the boards of numerous companies, a situation known as interlocking directorates, resulting in one family controlling multiple companies. One advantage of family control is that principal-agent conflicts of interests may be reduced, as the family members often sit on the board and/or manage the companies. On the other hand, family ownership can make it difficult to recruit quality outsiders for management and often leads to lack of concern for minority shareholders. Besides, there may be minimal transparency and low accountability by management. When a company operates in a sector that the government feels is strategically important or needs to produce some good that is essential to a country's population, or if the capital required exceeds what the private sector can fund, the corporation may be operated as a state-owned enterprise. A listed SOE is partly owned by the government or sovereign wealth fund and may also trade on an exchange, so there are minority shareholders. For such public listed SOEs, the management may have to balance between providing social benefits to the public and also adequate returns to shareholders. Institutional investors include pension funds, insurance companies, and mutual funds. Their collective investments can represent a large portion of equity ownership. As these investors tend to have considerable resources and market expertise, they can use informed judgment in exercising their shareholder rights. Also, although institutional investors may not own enough shares to be a controlling shareholder, they can typically exert influence on a firm's management and board to act in the interest of shareholders. Group companies, such as South Korea's Samsung, can achieve an outsized amount of control through cross-holding of shares via vertical and horizontal ownership. These cross-holding schemes make it difficult for outsiders to acquire shares. Cross-holding also increases the potential for the firms to participate in related party transactions that do not add value to minority shareholders. Private equity firms invest in private companies or public companies that they plan to take private. The involvement of private equity firms may bring beneficial changes to the firm's corporate governance, such as introducing performance-based compensation for managers or the addition of corporate codes. Foreign investors typically demand greater accountability and transparency. This is particularly true for investments in emerging markets. For example, if an India-based company decides to list in the US, the company's board and management will be subject to the same corporate governance standards as US companies. The minority shareholders of the company may stand to benefit from the potentially higher standards of governance. And lastly, the managers and board directors may also be influential shareholders of the company. When the directors and managers own significant shares in their own firm, their interests become more aligned with those of other shareholders. Being insiders, they're more likely to use the firm's resources to boost profitability over the long term. However, one might argue that there is also the potential for them to protect their own interests rather than those of other shareholders. And to end this lesson, let's quickly discuss some of the major ownership structure factors that impact corporate governance. Firstly, the board structure. Boards of directors can generally be categorized as one or two tier. A one-tier board is the most common and is made up of both internal directors and external directors. Internal directors are also known as executive directors and are typically senior managers employed by the firm. External directors are non-executive directors and are not part of the company management. Under a two-tier structure, which is required in countries such as Russia, Germany, and Argentina, the management board is overseen by a supervisory board. This supervisory board performs functions such as determining management compensation, supervising external auditors, and reviewing the firm's financial records. In some jurisdictions, representatives of stakeholders such as labor groups sit on the supervisory board. Besides the board structure, director independence is also an important factor. Independent directors are non-executive directors who have no other relationship with the company. Specifically, they should have no significant remuneration, ownership, or employment relationship with the firm. Independent directors are important in countries with dispersed ownership, where the principal-agent problem is greater, and thus the board's role of monitoring managers is key. This is especially so in the aftermath of corporate scandals like the Enron case. We learnt earlier that besides the principal-agent conflict, minority shareholders may also be disadvantaged if the controlling shareholder influences the managers to make decisions that disadvantage them. In some countries, authorities attempt to provide an advantage to minority shareholders through special voting arrangements for board nomination and election, such that the minority shareholders have the opportunity to elect board members that'll look after their interests. Next, corporate governance codes, laws, and listing requirements. Some countries have mandated national comply or explain corporate governance codes that require firms to either adopt best practices of corporate governance or explain why they have not. Some countries do not have national corporate governance codes, but make use of company law or regulation or stock exchange listing requirements to achieve similar objectives. And lastly, stewardship codes. Stewardship codes are voluntary codes that encourage investors to exercise their legal rights and increase their level of engagement in corporate governance. In some cases, stewardship codes are not entirely voluntary. For example, the UK Stewardship Code includes a duty for institutional investors to monitor the companies in which they invest and requires them to publish a comply or explain statement of commitment to the UK Stewardship Code. Phew! Told you this is not interesting stuff that gets your brain juices firing. Unfortunately, we're not done yet. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to evaluate the effectiveness of corporate governance policies and practices. See you again.